back to my employer. 350 employees. It's got $20 million in funding, around for 7 years. And we do something that is deceivingly very difficult, is that we provide a SaaS-based service where you can look up sales tax for a given product, time of day, and price, right? And particular location makes it a very complicated equation to answer. So we built a technology around that, and it's evolved our last 7 years. It's a .NET-based system, and we're in the business today because it is a very hard problem to solve. And it's even harder to solve fast, right? Because right now our service on a crufty old .NET infrastructure gives us about 50 milliseconds for your typical kind of average transaction, so we making a point of sale or your typical e-commerce transaction. We're proud of that. I plan for us to do a lot better. But what's deceiving about that figure is that you're assuming that it's really impacting the users, and it's impacting much less than you would think when you do the final equation. I'll wax philosophical for a second, but you do not deliver value to a customer till they receive traffic from you, till they receive your product. And the only way we can do that is through the internet. And it's so interesting how we take the liability out of the equation and think about our services being the issue when the reality is that last mile problem, if you will, well, last 1,000 miles. Getting that information on the user is what really makes it valuable to them. And of course, the ultimate limitation of that is good old C, right? Speed of light. We rarely encounter that. It's often a fraction of that, unless you're using a tree nose. We have to deal with that. But honestly, it's much more complicated than that, right? Not everything's fiber. There's a lot of elements in play that you have to somewhat abstract but be appreciative of. The real nemesis in performance on the network to get this value to your customers is round trip time. It's evil. It is the equivalent of dead air. It's where nothing is going on. Somebody's waiting for something from you, or waiting for somebody, and nothing gets done. It's like a live lock situation, if you're familiar with that. What we're going to talk about today is really focusing on that, the impact of that, how to minimize that, in some interesting ways you may have not thought of unless you peeled off the layers of the TCP protocol and IP and the like. So here's some example single round-trip latencies that account for a service latency of 50 milliseconds with the AvaTax service. What you see on the left-hand side there is our data center in Seattle. We are single DC. We have redundancy for business continuity only. And I should preface this whole conversation, I would like to keep it that way for a while. Until we're ready, Lots of complications there. What you see is a series of ascending round-trip times, which are, of course, correlating with the distance from Seattle to that location. You get all the way to Dublin, Ireland, 210 milliseconds. So we have to wait for a single round trip. I'm going to be talking about latencies that are actually a combination of multiples of round-trip times, where it gets really scary. And then mobile, which you get your 4G network, but latency is still an issue with these 4G and 3G networks, more than you would expect. Run a trace around them sometime or a ping, you'd be surprised. You have to take mobile into account and say, just to get that packet to you in that last mile may take that, in addition to where you may be in locale difference from Seattle. And we actually have a lot of mobile clients now that are coming online. So this discussion becomes more and more pertinent to the kind of experience we're trying to deliver. So, sextuple round trip latencies. Now, why I bring this up is because that's actually what we're counting today. We're counting 6 full round trips for minimal transactions. We shouldn't be. And you can see, Dublin's already 1 second. Mobile, forget about it. I mean, it's going to be over a second. And just to get to the East Coast, it's 470 milliseconds. Just to get to Eastern Oregon, it's 110 milliseconds. I think it's unforgivable, because I know the real latency, Eastern Oregon and Seattle, it's 8 milliseconds round trip. That's what it all should be. So the data center option keeps coming up. I brought that up. And it's a complicated question to answer. Just build a data center. Well, where are you going to build it, right? And how many? And then you have to cost the thing out. This thing could be money pits, right? It's always a different venture building a data center. There will come a day, and frankly, going to the cloud is really where I want to go. But I've got to make do with what I got right now, which is, what architecture is really about. So let's just not do it. Let's explore that possibility at least, because that's a pretty low cost thing to do, right? So let's remove service latency and throw in what is the ideal round trip cost, the theoretical minimum, using TCP, SSL, and HTTP. 4 round trips to be able to do that. 4 round trips, at those given round trip times I had in the earlier slides, removing service latency, we see something interesting. Eastern Oregon's 40 milliseconds, Dublin's down to 660 milliseconds. Those are okay, but that's the max theoretical right now we could get using existing protocols. We're not there yet, though, and we'll talk about that. Now, a single round trip is where I really like to get us. No service latency in the microseconds, I can get us there. And literally have a transaction completed in a single round trip, which existing TCP, SSL protocols will not allow you to do. So basically, you're incurring the cost of HTTP while getting all the interesting guarantees of security and traffic robustness and the like that TCP gives you. That would be beautiful. This is what we're up against. I brought this up several times. We're up against this software stack, if you will, protocol stacks, what we're really talking about. And some of these things are very intrinsic, right? How do you can tune TCP. How do you get rid of a whole round trip? Tuning is usually a fractional thing. There are some things you can incur some very interesting wins, but not what we're talking about. And then SSL, which is interesting. SSL, the argument against SSL often used to be it's computationally expensive. No, it's not. Not anymore. No. When SSL is slow, it's because of this round trips we're talking about. It's the network slowing you down now. It's it. It's space and time, not computations. And of course, good old HTTP, which, what can you do about that? That's just the lingua franca, and it works pretty darn good. So we're not going to talk about getting rid of that. So this laid out before you right now is really what's going on that's incurring us. Incurring us these round trips. This is the theoretical 4 round trip ideal case. And it's what you would see in a good web browser, downloading a small piece of content. It's not unusual. And the very first thing you see, setting up a TCP IP connection, you're negotiating your SSL, and you're ultimately executing all this work to do this. I want to send you a request server, I want you to send me a reply, which is where your round trip should really be spent. Here's the round trip cost of each one of these. 1 for TCP, 2 for SSL, 1 for HTTP, which is completely unavoidable, right? Jumped ahead a little too fast. So we've jumped a little bit in detail because we want to understand what we're up against here, but we have to go further. We have to get to the bottom of this. And it's not as complicated as what you might seem, because look, if it was complicated at the bottom of the internet, it wouldn't work. That's the genius of the internet. Let's talk about the most fundamental thing, a segment, which is not a packet, by the way. Packets don't exist on the internet in the way you expect. It's more abstraction. Segments is a unit of currency, unit of work on the internet. It's very simple pieces, packets of data that's moved across the internet. And it's brilliant because the responsibility of the internet is really to move these segments in and around. Everything else layered on top of that. Internet protocol is what kind of enables that movement. And it's very simple what it does. If you think about this, if a segment's a rail car, this is kind of the bill of lading, this is the sticker somebody splashed on the side of the car to say this is where it came from, this is where it's going. When you see it, make sure it just continues going forward. As well as what is its size, and of course, what is its contents. Brilliantly simple. It's worked for 30 years, mostly. And then you get to the transmission control protocol, which is interesting. What it is, if you will, it makes, excuse the analogy, it lets you create trains out of these little rail cars. Logical streams of data, because the internet is not about streams of data. Internet just sees a packet at a time, segment at a time, excuse me. And that's what you get. TCP is a way of hiding, abstracting an unfortunate reality. Yeah, it's the only way to make it manageable. TCP is very reliable. It works. But I'm going to demonstrate why it sometimes is not as beneficial as you would expect it to be for everything you give up to use it. SSL. SSL is, you just use it. You do financial transactions, anything, I mean, we got Gmail, you do your email over SSL. It's indispensable. And you cannot do a better job because 1 million people are trying to break SSL every day, and they do, and it just gets better and better and better. You'd be insane trying to do better than this. Could you use it without incurring that 2 round-trip penalty? You can. And then good old HTTP, which is MIME on steroids. That's what it really is. We all use it. There's nothing really to talk about here other than that's ultimately we want to be able to get to the point where you've set up a connection, and at that point you can execute your HTTP request. That's the whole point of the game, right? So round-trip time, to give it a proper definition, is the elapsed time between the transmission of a segment and the reception of its reply, discounting any service latency, application latency to happen between that. So here's what I did. Looking at the problem and getting anecdotes about how slow our service was. This is probably a second or third week on board. And we had a customer complaining. He had created a custom client. They wanted to look at it and understand, hey, why is it so slow? It must be slow. This client was in the Midwest, forget exactly where. The problem was his client was perfect. It's just we were that slow. Talking to tech ops, they would, they did a lot of testing. They produced that 50 millisecond value, but every time they produced that value, they did it in the data center. They had really no clear clue of how much of a penalty a customer is paying, what kind of varying conditions would affect the perception of our service. And this is where I get into kind of philosophy and the double meaning of that, the talk. So the double meaning there is water is 2 things. It's your water, which means that it represents you, right? This is something you're transmitting, it represents a value to the customer. So it's your brand, right? It's like your Avion. You treat it that way. And additionally, it's your water. You'd be surprised the kind of flexibility the internet provides you. Remember, again, I said the internet just moves packets. Doesn't care what's in those packets. If you can get it to move packets, if you can orchestrate IP, you can do some interesting stuff. And you don't necessarily have to reinvent a protocol. It's not a wise thing to do. So I just did the very basic thing. So I'm going to go to some place where I know would have a high round-trip time. And AWS EU, Ireland, Dublin, good place for that. Just did an SSL connection with curl to our AvaTax service in Seattle, and simply just hit a 404. I wanted to have an SSL termination point that I know has some proxy ability, and I know it would hit that without incurring any kind of latency from the service, so I could really get an accurate round-trip time. And this is, of course, what I got as a result of that, using TCP dump, monitoring this traffic, capturing these raw packets as much as I could, grab as much information I can, and it's absolutely useless for this conversation. Frankly, it's intimidating to even me to look at. That's insane. So can we make it a little more digestible, especially for the talk, and just for analysis, which is interesting about it? Because what do you really need to know for these kinds of analyses? Frankly, unless you're doing very low-level diagnostics, you don't need to know all that stuff in there. It's crazy. This is what you need to know. You need to know the latency between the packets we received on the client's interface. This is all being recorded from the client's interface, right? The TCP option flags, which is debatable, that's even useful. You know the first 2 are going to be, they're going to be synchronized. We're forming a TCP connection. After that, it's going to be pushes and ACKs, and I don't know how useful that's going to be, but it's there. And then you have payload size. Pardon me, let's keep slipping. Get corruption here. So now we've laid this out with these 3 columns, and we have the latency, the size, and the TCP flags. But that time column, it's kind of over the place. If you look, it's like 3 different orders of magnitudes of value. When you see that much variance, you've got noise. How do we move that noise? How do we make this more conceptual? Because I'd like to create a hypothesis. How would I be able to take this model and then optimize on it? See clearly what's going on. First, let's just talk about what's really there in terms of statistics, what we can immediately read from that data. Well, the round-trip time median is 165 milliseconds. There's 6 round trips, which is wrong. Immediately, there's bells and whistles going off. It should be 4. Time to first byte is 741. Now, time to first byte is really key here. Time to first byte is, as a client, everything is set up now that can actually send you my request. 7 to 41 milliseconds, it's like boiling a couple oceans for a cup of tea. I mean, that's all that work just so I can send you a couple bytes. And that's what's going on here. And time to last byte, of course, is just when it gets the full response from the server. Then there's 2 additional pieces of this that are more constants. We'll talk about this. TCP latency is, interesting situation going on here is incurring 40 milliseconds of latency. So I could be in Oregon with 8 millisecond latency round trip time, and I still see that 40. Same thing with the 74 SSL latency, which is less interesting. What's really interesting on the surface of the thing, I only transmitted 6.4K in 1.1 second. That's criminal. So let's transform these latencies really quickly into symbolics, right? And anytime we see something in a couple percentage points, 165, that's a round trip. And there's a lot of clear, strong signals for round trips in this case. It's really nice to read. And then you got your unknowns. We'll call these constants for now. They just don't make any sense. Likely a client or a server thing outside the protocol stack. We mark those just as the numbers, right? And then we have epsilon. A lot of these numbers are just simply microseconds or even small milliseconds. They represent probably delay between packets coming out of the client. Just small variances in network traffic. We don't need to pay attention to those. So let's clean that up. Now, it's very clear what's really going on. Anything marked with epsilon, doesn't matter, right? It's not incurring, it's a penalty. It's not really a factor in the equation. Every time you see RTT, which makes sense, they're all coming from the server, from the client perspective, oh, that's where you got to be concerned. Those are your strong signals. And these constants, we'll talk about those. Now taking the initial statistics, we've created a model up here to say, given the existing client, I could take any known location. I could take Mars, round trip time of Mars. I know how long it would take to complete this transaction. I have a model to work with now. And we see the clear cost of this. To get to the time to first byte, it takes full 4 round trips, just for me able to send a byte. And then ultimately get the response back from the server, it's taking 6. Interesting, there's 2 between 4 and 6 in HTTP. That means something's going wrong there as well. So here are the protocols. Let's focus on TCP really quick in the conversation. We'll go through this really quick because it would just bore you to death. It's very simple, right? The very first thing you have to do is a client sends a synchronized packet. Server responds in turn, and of course takes a whole round trip. And the client acknowledges that. Pretty cut and dry stuff. Run round trip. Now let's get into the fun stuff, the SSL. SSL is these 2 round trips. How much time I spent talking about the protocol, but it's pretty simple. Client hello is, hey, this is what I'm capable of in terms of SSL versions and ciphers, and I'll sprinkle a little randomness on it. So you don't do any replay attacks. It's not possible. Well, it still is, but that's another story. Server hello, certificate is basically saying to the server, say, hey, look, I saw your request. I see the version support. This is what I'm going to agree. And of course, it's a statement of an edict, if you will, that you're going to do this. And here's my certificates, right? Here's my identity, my X59 certificates. And then the client decides on some secret. This is the client key exchange portion of this. It says, okay, I've generated a secret. We're going to share this. And I share it by encrypting it with your public key and sending it over the wire, plain text to you. And you're going to decrypt it. And we agree on this shared cipher key. That's what SSL is about, just getting that shared cipher key, that shared secret, securely transferred, that secure state transfer between 2 machines. It's what it really is. And then, of course, it's saying I'm finished. Hey, everything from this point forward is going to be encrypted. Server says in kind, hey, I agree. Let's do this. Get it on. And this is what it looks like in the packet capture. It's pretty big. It's 10 packets or segments. Okay, we're saying that. The first interesting you notice is that latency of 74 milliseconds. Let me just put that to rest right now. It's kind of interesting how your testing environment generates these artifacts. That's 74 milliseconds because I'm in a very quiet machine. And a very quiet machine doesn't produce a lot of entropy. And what does a good random number generator need? Entropy. So it's literally waiting there for enough entropy to be generated to say, okay, I feel safe sending this random value out. 74 milliseconds, how long that takes. So I found out that OpenSL does not do this. This version of curl was compiled with NSS, where they take that more religiously, apparently. So you've got that, and then, of course, as you expect, the client hello goes out, and a round trip time occurs for that. Okay, so that round trip time at number 5, what that is simply a server come back saying, okay, I agree, we're going to do this. Here's the SL version we're going to use. It's, I think it's TLS1, RC4, MD5. Doesn't really matter. At this point, the client has to come back. Yeah. You see 3 round trips in this already. We talked about 2 round trips. First round trip, that's a server coming back and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. As we look through this, we notice that that quote-unquote server hello message is actually distributed among 5, 7, and 9. I'm sorry I didn't mark this. Should have been our job. Point is that server hello message coming from back to the SSL server. It's not one single segment. It's coughed up into actually 3 segments, actually 4. And this is where it gets interesting. When does the client actually talk back to that server? Actually happens on 13, line 13 right there. That doesn't seem right. That's a lot of stuff going on for the client to finally be able to respond and say, hey, we got to encrypt now, let's do this. So what's happening is this, it's fascinating. We've got a large bulk of certificates being pushed down the client. It needs that, right? But it hits a limit before I can send the whole thing. So now you have a deadlock situation. The client is waiting for the full delivery of this server hello message, and the server's waiting on something from him. And what that thing is an acknowledgement packet. Initial C window. Remember this is very important. What's happened is this. Something called the TCP slow start algorithm and the congestion window, and it kills performance. Really just deadens it. At this point, the server's thinking, I've sent you 3 packets, segments. I haven't heard back from you. Of course, a round trip prevents that, right? It doesn't want to send you anything more until it hears back from you. This is an arbitrary value decided. In fact, in TCP spec, I believe it's set at 1. So you can occur this right after the initial TCP synchronize. Well, after the initial server hello, right? The point of this is that it's being pessimistic. And you find that in a lot of these protocols, this pessimism. And it's not so much called for. It is in certain situations, but you don't have to necessarily pay attention to that. In this case, in this study, we're not going to talk about changing NIT coint, because sometimes you don't have control over that. We're going to work around it, which helps us understand a little bit more. But this is what's happening. The server says, I've sent you 3 segments. I've heard nothing back from you. Of course, it has to wait a full round trip for that packet to come back, actually half a round trip, technically. We have to find a way to serve fewer segments. If you note, let's go back here real quick, just a reference. It's transmitting 4 packets for server hello. If we could just slip it into 3. And it's frustrating because that last one, it's 56 bytes. I'm next to 4. 56 bytes, that's the one it didn't fit. If we could just fit it in there, we could actually masquerade that whole initialization window or congestion window delay and actually waiting for a response from the server or from the client. Beautiful. We could masquerade that there, we get a full round trip win. Well, how do we do that, right? We have to understand a little bit more about SSL. Sorry, we're going to plug in a little deeper. The granularity of the SSL messages are, I think I explained them earlier, they're laid out here, right? It's a client hello, and then what's coming from the server is actually 2 messages being sent in succession, server hello and certificate bundle. I wonder what would Google do? Those guys are pretty smart. They've probably tuned the hell out of this stuff, right? So let's collect some statistics from Google. I used OpenSSL client tool against AvaTax to get more detail about these messages, to crack these things open, right? And this is what I learned. Everything's pretty identical, except there's 2 messages that are different. Certificate, huge difference. AvaTax sending 4,300 bytes. Google, 1625. Google knows something we don't. Google's doing something right, for sure. Client key exchange is interesting. I just have to mention it. Notice it's almost a multiple 2? Because Google, on their API servers, whatever reasons, using 1024-bit certificate. Odd. Oh, we're using 2048-bit certificate. That's why. It's rarely explained and not a big deal. But that certificate, we got to dig in further, understand what it is. The great thing about it, it's something under our control, right? We can set up these certificates, we can manage, we can buy them wherever we want to. Let's see what we can do about this. So when I use the OpenSSL client tool to dump the certificates being sent by the server for Google, this is what I get. It's actually a certificate chain. So the server is actually representing itself by 2 certificates. Now, the root CA, which you don't see here, is of course stored in your local certificate store. So it doesn't need to transmit this. It doesn't need to transmit these 2. Now, this is what AvaTax is doing. 3. I asked them about this. They're saving money by doing this, these intermediary relationships, because the idea is there's more value. The closer the signing is to the root CA, the more value, the more authority it has. So apparently we're diluting value here. It's fine. It's a frugal thing to think about, but no one had ever thought, and no one would ever even know, it's actually costing us a full round trip. This is costing us a full round trip right now. So whatever money we saved, I don't know if it was worth it. So theoretically, you just cut out one of these. You go out and buy a new certificate with just at least 2, like at least Google has. We'd save that 56 bytes. To do, buy a better server certificate, save 1 round trip. I didn't have to do anything, right? Interesting. Now on to HTTP. We saw true round trips in there. Let's try to understand why. I'll tell you right up front. It doesn't make a lot of sense why it's taking this long. What you see right there is very simple. The server in the green is the client sending out an HTTP request that we all know and love. Pretty elementary stuff in the form of an SSL record. And then the server comes back, he sends 37 bytes, and he just waits. Now here's where it gets interesting. There's no reason why he should be waiting, and the client agrees. The client doesn't immediately acknowledge it. That explains the latency of that 39 milliseconds to line 17. Server's like, okay. So they were smart when they optimized these TCP stacks, and one of the smart things is to understand that, of course, segments, even if it's just an acknowledgement segment, which are typically zero length, they're expensive. It's a unit of work for the internet to push that segment around. So what they try to do is be optimistic about the idea is, well, a new packet's probably come out from the client, and I'll just piggyback the acknowledgement on that. So the client, and there's actually a stack parameter that describes this value, 39 milliseconds, something close to it, to say, this is how long I will wait, an act delay, I believe it is, before I'll eventually send an acknowledgement packet. Otherwise, I'll try to wait as long as I can. Now, usually it's not an issue, but now you have a server that's acting very odd. There's no reason for this. And notice that ultimately he gets this acknowledgement packet, and he sends the rest of the request. It doesn't make any sense. It's not a congestion window issue. It is a bug, and likely an SSL termination hardware. How long has it been there, though, right? How long has it been there? Or it could be a configuration issue. But nobody knew it was here. It doesn't make any sense. So for any of these small requests been going on our service for the last, I don't know, year, have been incurring these two penalties, which is, do the math, that's a 33% penalty on all our transactions. And there's not a single line of code I need to change to get a 33% improvement, perceived improvement on our service. Oh, there you go. So, to do. Fix the darn server, man. It's a patch, made a configuration thing. I don't have it up here, but I'll serve as an epilogue. Some things just don't pass the smell test. What doesn't pass the smell test here is that you don't see in the transaction. I cut it off the end. There's a fin packet to go out at the end of a TCP connection and close it down. It's a polite thing to do. One will come out the client, and it'll be acknowledged by the server, or vice versa, whoever gets there first. At the very end, there's this mysterious phantom fin packet that comes through. That shouldn't be there. That means there is something really strange going on, because that's out of the protocol spec. Smell test, not a good thing to see something like that. So by addressing these two issues, certificates, right? Get a smaller certificate. As well, fixing the darn server, we get it done 4 round trips, which we wanted. That's the ideal, it's the theoretical minimum. Or is it? Can we do better than this? Let's rock and roll this, man. Seriously, let's push it. And this is where it gets to your water, man. This is my customers. I want to maximize my value by leveraging as much as I can by what the internet provides me. Why am I going to rely upon TCP and SSL? It could be competitive advantage to throw those things away. And understanding the risk is probably the best thing to do. It's a huge risk, yes, but I'm going to argue, no, it's not. So we can get rid of 1 round trip immediately by something we all have probably used today several times. SSL sessions. I'll explain that little disappearing bit here in a second. SSL sessions is this. SSL sessions is saying, I went through the expense of setting up an SSL session with a server. And I have a way of preserving that state, so any point in time I can come up and say, hey, remember me? Here's my credentials. And there's a cryptographic means to say, oh, I remember you. I'm certain I know who you are, at least mathematically so. In the past, it was often perceived that this was an optimization for computation. No, it's not. It still has to do an RSA operation. It really is about reducing 1 whole round trip. If any argument for SSL session I've ever heard, that's the best one. Now we're down to 3 round trips for a web service transaction. And I could do this today. It doesn't even matter software. It's a matter of just putting the right appropriate configuration parameters to a Java client, straight native code, whatever. I mean, it's nothing, it's trivial, right? Now we're going to get into a little bit deeper in SSL, not too deep. I want to see how far we can push the optimization of SSL. We're actually going to get 1 more round trip out of SSL. In fact, we're going to get to 0 round trips with SSL, stay within protocol, incur no penalty, and get all the wonderful benefits of SSL. Here's how we're going to do it. What really drives an SSL session is that super secret stuff in the client key exchange. What it is, and don't make it too complicated, simply say that the client has generated, with enough randomness, a pretty good cipher that he can share between himself and use a symmetric cipher like RC4. And it's got to get that cipher that it's generated locally over to the server. I think I mentioned this earlier. So what does it do? Well, it takes a certificate, public certificate, that it has available to it, and this is during the full initialization, right? Encrypts it and sends it off to the server. Okay, it's got that. Notice, though, we don't need to worry about any of that stuff the second time we come around. We don't need to worry about the fact that, look, the fact that I remember who you are and the fact that I could send this off to you in encrypted form and you're impersonating somebody, you can't do anything with it, what's the harm in that, right? There is none. So let's go one more on this. Let's get this last round trip out of here, man. I want it out of there. Get it out. This is the solution. Chrome has been doing something for a long time. They quit doing it recently, and it's not so much their fault. It's the vendor's fault. Something called the SSL. It's actually, probably to say, the TSL false start. It's freaking cool. I believe it's one of the security researchers over at Google who noticed this, and it's just pure reasoning. Going back and looking at this, we removed the server hello, right? It removed the certificate portion, assuming that we were to have a session generated. We were able to start it up cold like this, right? What's interesting about this is that the super secret stuff, again, goes over the server, and it needs to, even in session, right? Because I may actually have client-side SSL sessions, which are provided by the SSL session ticket extension, which is very cool. I'll talk about that a little bit. That client, super secret stuff needs to go over the server, and then we need to send a message saying we're finished, but what's that finished message coming out from the server? What's so interesting about it? How does it enable the encrypted conversation? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. That's what's interesting about it. Why would I sit around and wait for it? Let me tell you what's in these finished messages. It's a cool idea, by the way, and it's necessary in highly secure communication, especially for the initial SSL negotiation. What those finished messages are from both the client and server say, this is what I saw. These are all the bits that I saw. I'm going to encrypt those, or excuse me, cryptographically hash those. I'm going to send you a copy of that. And of course, cryptographically hash that too, so nothing can really be modified, right? You're going to detect somebody's been tampering with it. Server's going to do the same thing. Oh, by the way, this is what I saw on my side. If you don't agree, somebody's been tampering with your data. Now, what's the worst they can do? Now, this is what comes down to configuration. It's not the protocol breaking itself, but the fact that people are still running SSL 2.0 or running weak ciphers. And what a man-in-the-middle attack would look like in this kind of situation is say, okay, I have an opportunity to downgrade you to SSL 2.0, which has known vulnerabilities, or put in a null cipher, which is possible. You should support those things in the client or the server. You should just completely reject those. So whereas the SSL false start would ultimately put you at some jeopardy if you maintain those rigors, right? Don't let anybody do anything like that. Who would be doing SSL 2.0? But a lot of these clients actually send that out. It's insane. I don't know who uses SSL 2.0, but it's not a good idea, right? So at the point that super secret stuff hits the server, that's the point here, it can start decrypting our traffic. What are you doing waiting for the server message? If the man in the middle didn't intercept my traffic, there's nothing they could do with it, as far as I know. So let's flip the script. See what we did there? I'm sending out in succession client hello message. Hey, let's get an SSL session started. Here's my previous SSL session, that client key exchange. I'm going to oversimplify a little bit. Here's my finished message, because let's stay within the protocol. Why not? But then right behind that, I'm sending my HTTP request. I'm not waiting. 0 round trip. I've initialized SSL connection. Right behind it to come my request. There's no delay outside of microseconds. Epsilon. And then, of course, eventually that server finished message could come over. It's probably a good idea to look at it anyways and verify, hey, something weird go on here. All right, it's good. Good practice. Don't throw best practice just because you're bending the rules a little bit. That's something I definitely recommend to you. Now look at the scoreboard. 101. We're getting down to the bottom, man. 2 down, 1 to go, because we can't get rid of HTTP. What can we do? Can we live without TCP? Let's talk about what TCP does. It builds that train we were talking about. Keeps those trains in order. And by the way, there's no guarantees that TCP can do this. It's only doing its best to orchestrate that as a possibility. The idea that you're missing a packet, you didn't get it, TCP is smart to say, oh, something's missing in the sequence. Hey, can you send that again? It's not going to guarantee you ever get it. There's no guarantees of that. It does its best. And to make sure you don't see these things in the application, what's the beauty of TCP? My God, the monstrosity, the terrible dark happenings underneath the layers of the internet, you don't want to see that application level because you wouldn't get anything done. Creates this nice layer of abstraction, makes the word look ideal. But let me ask you this. In as much as TCP can fail just as much as any other protocol, you get a TCP reset, packet never arrives, it's going to fail just like any other protocol. And when you further optimize the thinking around this is say, look, this is going to be a very short message. And I want to underscore that. When I'm talking about SaaS, I'm not talking necessarily about SOAP message. I'm talking about like a REST message, right? Very quick. Look, I need to make a quick point of sale and sales tax. It could be 1K. It could be very, very small. Throw some HTTP compression. We're talking business now, right? So exposure to these kinds of sunspots of the internet, so to speak, these random failures, my exposure surface is very small for these kinds of. I can take more risks than I can if these are very long-lived financial transactions. These are connections. These are simply requests. Request, reply, request, reply. It's all I need this protocol to do for me in this short span of a few milliseconds. That's it. By definition, doesn't SSL guarantee some of the same things? SAN's ability to kind of ask for retransmitted packets, try to sort things around. It doesn't do those things well, but it does do one thing. If anything's out of place, it'll let you know, because that tamper-proof mechanism, it's the same thing. Something's out of place, not where expect. Bells and alarms are going to go off. Let me ask you this. If you build a protocol out of this and you use, the TCP has some nice semantics, right? Semantics of SSL would be like, hey, something's broken. But that's interesting because you incurred such little effort to bring up that SSL session and find something's broken that you can do it 3 or 4 times, you can consecutively fail, and you still have not incurred the same expense if you just did it the right way. It's true. Why not? Failure happens, right? I think, well, especially in cloud environments. I mean, you got to be prepared for that. We're just not used to thinking about it at this level before. Why not? Give it a shot. Not suggesting we build our own protocol, right? That's insane. I am suggesting, though, you use the fundamental properties of IP to move the data around without having the guarantees that TCP gives you and having the detection abilities of SSL to say, something broke. There's a protocol around this. God bless these people. Somebody's thinking about this. The DTLS. It's a delta right now to the TLS 1.2 spec. It's existed in one form or another. I believe it's a delta to the TLS 1.0 or 1.1 spec since 2005. It is implemented in OpenSSL since 2008. And it uses UDP. And UDP is actually a very lightweight, again, datagram protocol. It doesn't work in terms of strings, right? It simply says, look, I got a packet of data. I can tell you what port it goes on a machine and say which machine it goes to, but that's about it. I'll tell you a length and has a checksum on it. All SSL needs is a transport layer, right? And if we take SSL and put on top of UDP, which this protocol does, we got everything we need. We're not going to get corrupted traffic. We may get some failures, but when you're talking about, 15 packed segments of data, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Look at the scoreboard now. 3 down. I didn't really do much either. I don't really have to show much code for this. Yeah, you have to do a little code. SSL false start requires some tricks, but it's supported as well. Google's been doing it for years. If Google's doing it, there's best practices for it. There's a lot of anecdotes about it. You're safe to do it. You don't want to play a security game naively, though. You don't want to just crack an OpenSSL and think you've got a secure client secure server. That's something you let somebody else look at for you. But I'm telling you, it's not as hard if you keep it simple. So now let's look where we started from, right? And compare it to where we are now. We're talking about one round trip. Within the boundaries of the protocols the internet provides, we've invented nothing new. 8 milliseconds versus 48 milliseconds, Oregon. 7 milliseconds, 420 milliseconds, Virginia, and then 165 versus almost a full second in Ireland. It's 500% faster across the board. Of course it would be, right? Everything's a function of those round trip multiples. That's really all to say on the matter. I just keep it simple. The whole point of this talk is to represent how I didn't have to build a damn data center. I literally have created virtual data centers. I've created an opportunity. I've literally moved Seattle 5 times closer to all these locales you'd otherwise assume that I would have to do this outside of using superluminal communication or something like that. I'm being cheap but also being resourceful. But I think the whole point of this exercise really is that I took the opportunity, not being a TCP expert, but having been using these tools for some time, to say, I'm really going to try to understand what's going on. And by doing that, I achieved an immediate 33% efficiency, right? I discovered a number of things wrong. I've been there for a long time. But then when I began to look just a little bit closer, I'm not a TCP expert, I'm not a RFC out there, but I got us this 5% gain by just really understanding and appreciate what the internet is. And never forget that. It's your water, right? This internet was built to move your traffic. They have some brilliant protocols out there. There's a streaming version of STCP, there's Speedy coming online. Look into this stuff. And don't do it blindly, though, because you are committing to somebody else's vision of how the internet works when you do that. You are committing to somebody else's optimization points. Are they dealing with large traffic, synchronous traffic, dealing with message passing, asynchronous message passing, or just request reply? Ask yourself that each protocol has different benefits and disadvantages to that. But you want to tune into that. But the options are out there. Don't. And especially in your data center. And I don't know how many of you have encountered this. How many people have ever encountered a situation where you have a database load script and it's just taking forever? And then you realize every single time you're doing a transaction, it's actually bringing up a whole new TCP connection. Then you slowly begins to dawn upon you, wow, TCP is kind of expensive. Even in a data center, those round trips are expensive. Talk about the cloud, where you got a lot of variance, not just your stock round trip times, but the variance in that traffic also affects, exposes you to lots. So you don't want to expose yourself to round trip times, you don't have to do it. But streaming protocols in particular, the connectionless and stateless, are very well within means of most moderate programmers. Tell you, challenge yourself, go out and design your own tonight, learn a little about it, get hurt, scrape your knee, and then pull out one off the shelf that solved a lot of those problems. I think you find a lot of benefit. And I don't know how many, we talk about distributed, especially the distributed data problems. I'm telling you right there, it's not the speed of the hard disk. It's how quickly you can move that data across, just even across a switch. How many people just, when you know you have to move data off a machine over network, I go in cold sweats. That's where stuff breaks. That's you're like, okay, it used to be 5 minutes, boss, now it's going to be a day. And the question is that day based upon real solid knowledge of what you're dealing with, the penalties been for, or is it just something naive? Oh, I haven't tuned my TCP window sizes correctly. There's a whole slew of things there. Learn this stuff. Learn stuff. There's so much great material out there, tutorials. The best thing you can do, go home tonight, whenever, fire up TCP dump. It's on your Mac, which Windows installed something like this as well, and just play with it, watch this stuff, understand what's noise and what's really important, and appreciate it. Then go in your data center and do the same thing. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to see things like a lot of people have missed. And I think it's a pretty lightweight experiment, actually, at the end of the day. I recommend some tools. I would say Wireshark. Look, if you guys are looking at something like this, OpenSSL S client, if you're looking to cracking packets S server as well. There's a lot of interesting parameters you can set up to test various scenarios for performance of SSL. And DTLS, by the way, is built into the OpenSSL S client S server. If you ever want to play with that and see how the performance of that, you can benchmark it now. That's it. You can answer any questions.
So is the false start basically the process of sending the HTTP request before you wait for the second half of the handshake?
That's exactly it. The question is, are we just not waiting for we're sending out the HTTP request before we even get the finished message from the server? That's TLS SSL false start. That's the heart and core. Yeah.
One more question. Yeah. How many segments do you guys run into in one of these request responses? So like, how many segments does the request have?
So what you see right there, that 21, something like this, I think the time to last byte, segments to last byte, let's call that. I think it was 17. That's what we're seeing. But I want to give you an idea of like Google in the same situation, 13, maybe even 12. Yeah, I think maybe even 12 segments. There's an efficiency there. That does not preclude, though, I mean, that doesn't answer your question entirely. What is the size of the request? And frankly, the size of the request usually fits in 2 segments, and the response coming back is pretty much equivalent to what you saw in this example. So if you saw that right now, we'd fixed, with what we have today, that would be an extra 2 segments.
Okay, so like 2 going out. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So sort of piggybacking on the false start. SSL configuration? That's client dependent, right? Is that something that you can set up?
Okay, so interesting question. Google tried to answer that very question. The question is, I mean, of course, is it client dependent? What Google found, they said, wow, this is a cool trick. How well does it work with the server implementations out there? And they found about 98% of the server implementations it works with out there, except for a couple big vendors who have these weird edge cases. And this is why today it's not activated in Chrome. You can activate it. But today, because, and they've, I guess at this point they remain nameless, have refused to fix a couple small things. And for that very reason, Google has turned off SSL false start. There's nothing fundamentally wrong, but yes, generally, it's a client-side thing. Yeah. No? No.
So what is your current best that you've implemented? Because like some of these require the clients to participate. What is the, where's your status right now?
Okay, so the status is that clients are interesting, right? And they're very conservative, especially in the financial industry. So I can come in very excited about, oh, you need to do this, you need to do this. And they ask, well, do I need to reinstall something? Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm not going to do it then. It's not that important to me. With some of the mobile vendors we're talking about, the mobile payment vendors, they're really excited about this, right? And they're more progressive about this. But really getting it implemented and what is kind of an enterprise environment is difficult, but I have a solution for that. And it works quite well, a local proxy. The idea is you take the typical transactions you already have, put a local proxy, speaks this kind of accelerated protocol, right? Sit local on the machine, play with SC host if you will, or if not, just redirect to the local host under a special port. And you get all the benefits of this without modifying the client at all. It's completely transparent. It requires little tricks with the SSL certificates, but nothing too difficult, right?
Do you provide any kind of sample client server application which can verify all this theory?
Oh, I'm sorry, what was that again?
Do you provide any kind of a sample client server?
I should, and I debated that. And I feel bad. I would say that if you find stuff in slideshare.net anytime soon, like a couple weeks, you will find that, because I think it's important. At the very least, I would like to show, and I didn't get S-server and S-client, OpenSL utility, demonstrating that, I think is good. But also, would also want to demonstrate with SSL full start, which I don't think you get with S-client and server. I want to show this thing really working. I have cobbled something together that I'd be embarrassed to show anyone, in Perl, believe it or not, because everything's really written in Perl. But I did get it working. I did demonstrate this. I saw it work. I was impressed it actually worked over WAN, which was one of my biggest debates. Will UDP work over WAN? Works just fine. That's what we do with DNS all day, right? So stay tuned.
Okay. One more follow-up question was that if we move the SSL negotiations in UDP, you said, right?
Yeah.
So who takes care of retransmissions? SSL? Retransmissions, and like TCP takes care of retransmissions and acknowledgement. You said SSL takes care of that?
Well, SSL, okay, so I misspoke a little bit. I oversimplified something, but let me clarify. SSL will detect if something's out of place, but it can't do anything about it, right? So it does give you the same benefit, at least it's saying this is a corrupted stream, but it doesn't know what happened. It doesn't know if somebody tampered with it. In the DTLS protocol, which is a delta of TLS 1.2, they actually have sequence numbers, which used to be implied. You're also forced to use block ciphers because of that, but it's interesting. In the case where at least you've got out-of-order packets received in the DTLS protocol, they can resort those. SSL would just throw an error. But in terms of retransmits and the like, no, it's not going to do that. Yeah. It's not going to do congestion control either, but these are short messages, so we don't need to worry about that. Yeah.
So DTLS and routing OpenSSL does mean that any daemon that actually uses OpenSSL supports DTLS by default?
You know, I don't know. I could answer that fairly. I would say there could be a number of compiler options. By default, I do not believe that to be true, though.
Okay, so which one really don't support DTLS?
Well, to put it this way, I think it's ultimately how you use the API. That is to say that if you use the API and the facility gives you, you can implement and it's a stock DTL server and provide that. Is it something you just turn a switch on and immediately use? I'm not aware of one. It doesn't mean there isn't one. I'm just not aware of one. Sure be nice. But. And one thing to preface this whole conversation, I should have, is I've got the liberty of not having to actually worry about web browsers. I have full control over the web client, why I come at a different way of thinking that I never, if I had web browsers, this could never happen. You have to wait for Speedy. Speedy's an answer for this, really, in the client world. But because you have full control of both ends, man, hey, you can do whatever you like. Whole point of those, though, I didn't have to invent my own protocol, which just, man, you better know what you're doing. Because even the experts get it wrong, right? So, excellent. Questions? Thank you. Thank you.